Hello, everyone, and thank you, Elle, for the introduction. I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation with you today, Paris, because while we've been friends for quite a few years now, I've never really had the opportunity to introduce you officially in front of a crowd like that before. But for those of you who don't know Paris, which I can't imagine are many people, she is an absolutely spectacular person who has achieved a lot in her career. And in a world where everyone is always competing to be the first person to do something, Paris certainly holds many of those titles in the UK. She first made her mark on UK society when she was a firebrand activist for Vice and wrote a column there which was often described as quite provocative, quite outrageous. And since then, she has become a voice of a generation in her groundbreaking career. And she was one of first Channel 4's and Radio 1's first transgender presenter. She was the first openly trans woman to be on Question Time. And she was also the first openly transgender woman to appear in British Vogues. And then she made headlines when she was named the first columnist of Vogue as well, who was a trans woman. But she has, beyond that, also shaped conversations around identity, equality, representation, and social change. But her critically acclaimed debut book called What It Feels Like for a Girl, and a memoir which is a memoir based on her life from 13 to 18, was praised for its honesty, its power, and cultural impact. And since then, she had a series commissioned by the BBC, an 8-part series, which also had rave reviews, which I hope some of you have seen. And if you haven't, you absolutely should go watch it after this conversation. But I know me and Paris have had quite a lot of conversations around the book, around the show, and around that process, both the sort of positives and negatives of that. But I really wanted to start with maybe looking at a little bit what you learned along the way. So as people might know, your memoir and the show is quite deeply personal to you. So what were your sort of guiding principles when you were trying to keep the heart of that story and adapting it to screen? What was the sort of difficulty of navigating that process as someone who wants to tell your own story, but there are also industry expectations about what a TV series needs to be and what needs to be achieved in sort of today's climate?
Thank you so much for that. And can I just say hello to everybody? Yeah, I think that, I'd never really had any plans for it to be a television show. I think I was so focused on writing the book. And I had this sort of vague, watery idea, oh, maybe it could make it to the screen one day. And I'm not from a world where I've ever done, as you may know, I'm just from a council estate, so I don't know anybody, that's written a book or gone through that process. I mean, obviously I've met people in my career, but I think it's fair to say it was all new to me. And so when we finished the publicity for the book, I was ready to just go and collapse in a heap on the floor and, not speak to anybody for 6 months. And then we had all of these production companies getting in contact, which sounds like a humble brag, but it was a very good problem to have. And it was clear that, that there would be interest for television. And of course, I wanted to do it because it's my story. How can I just hand it over to other people? It's my family, it's my friends, it's created out of my core memories. And so there were just so many reasons, the politics of it and it being authentic, but also, I just, on an emotional level, I just wanted to give it a go. But I'd never done screenwriting before, and everybody was saying, oh, it's great, it's going to be a really great learning process. And it's like, I kind of don't want to be learning on this. I just want to nail it, because whether or not we got the green lights really did depend on the strength of the pilot. So I really did go back to school. And I think the thing I want to say as well is that I'm not sure anybody here would say this, but I do feel a bit paranoid that maybe that there's an idea that maybe this was just greenlit because, the BBC's being woke, and I'm absolutely sure that, it being a story written by a trans person, that features that is definitely in the mix of why this was a story that they wanted to tell. But you know, I've got a lot of friends who are writers, who are trans, who've been trying to get projects off the ground, and you know, I think they chose this because we put the work in with the book, we put the work in with the pilot. You know, it wasn't a diversity tick, it just so happens to be diverse, and so we really did have to work to get that green light, and I'm just so grateful to the BBC for giving us the home to it, really, because you know, we had some offers from some other channels, but I just feel like even in this age where we've got so many different ways of watching things, if something goes on the BBC, people know about it and they hear about it. And I really did want people to watch it and just start a conversation, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, you know, when it's, as you said, it's your personal story, you know, you don't want someone else to tell that story, but at the same time, when you do go into a production of a show, you are sort of giving up a little bit of control there, I think, because adapting a memoir to screen is a different process. How did you go around, you know, protecting that truth of your working class background from Hucknall and against those pressures to maybe fit into a narrative around the industry and around making a show? What was that? When did you have any clashes with sort of figuring that process out, and how was that?
Well, first of all, just the writing process itself was like really different, because, you know, I'm used to, my background is writing comment pieces and features and then writing the book. And I think it's fair to say that I'm neurodivergent, and I'm happiest when it's just me and the page and obsessing over where to put a comma, right? When you're writing a book, you really are kind of like God of what you're doing, you know, and particularly when you're writing a memoir, it's very hard to tell somebody, you know, this is wrong, because it's your story. And for example, you know, the book is written in like regional dialect. It didn't work for everybody. I think it put some people off, but it was like, that's how I wanted to say it, and that's what felt authentic to me. And so Penguin were really just like, well, you know, this is working, or we'd like to see more of this, or maybe that's not working, and then you go away and you fix it. But screenwriting, you've got sort of, you know, you're almost writing by committee. You know, you've got draft after draft after draft. And so it became clear, even though I had a lot of control and power, actually, particularly for somebody who's never written for television before. I mean, it was such a surreal experience. You wouldn't be going in at that kind of like showrunner level ordinarily, to be given that. But it's like, they're kind of teaching you how to screenwrite. Well, it's a bit like you've been commissioned to make the cake for the royal wedding and you've never made a cake before, and so you get the cake expert and they say, well, for a cake you need like 30 eggs, and you go, oh, okay, and then they go, no, but make it your own, you know, and it's got to be excellent. So it was a very surreal kind of baptism of fire, and you know, it was I think it was a battle at times to, you know, make sure that things were authentic. And I think I realised it. Well, have we got TV people in the room today? Have we got any producers? Okay, there's a few. I don't mean to offend anybody. I did sort of realise, because I thought, it feels like, well, we're all doing the same thing here, you know, because we're telling a story. We want to get the show made. I did realise about halfway through that maybe what I was doing wasn't necessarily what the producers were doing, because I feel as a writer, without wanting to sound pretentious, I feel what I'm doing is just telling the truth, you know, and that's really important to me. And I think that you can be very singularly focused on that, and actually putting together something like this, it's like putting together a music festival or something. You've got to get all these hundreds of people into one place and on set, and, you know, persuade people to give you money, and, you know, persuade talent to come in and all the rest of it. So it was a really different process, actually, and I was involved as much as I could be, you know, across casting, locations, but there were so many different moving parts to it. And I'm going to be honest with you, it was really, 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 really difficult to let go of that, because I am a bit of a control freak and I'm a bit of a perfectionist. as I think a lot of creative people are. But when it's your story, when it's, you know, your mum that's being represented, and for example, I'll give you a concrete example of this sort of conflict. There's one part of the storyline where we had to put in a bit of conflict between the character Lady Di and the character Byron, that's based on me, and so we have Byron sort of lying about where they are and you know, going to something, and that's why they don't go with Lady Di to support her at an audition. And it's just a simple thing. It's, oh, we need something in the script here, kind of thing, and it slipped through the net. It's not the end of the world, but it's really painful because actually I have a lot of faults as a person, but I'm pathologically honest. I mean, I've made a career out of oversharing, you know, and so it's like, seriously, like and so it's really difficult because it's like when you say that this character isn't being completely honest, no one else is going to care about that as much as, but it's saying something that's fundamentally not me. And I think anybody in this room would really struggle with that if something is really fundamental to your identity. So every single detail from, you know, I love the show. I'm really proud of it and all the work that's been done on it. But I'm telling you, I could sit here for 10 hours and do everything wrong with what it feels like for a girl, because you can't produce something that you care about so much and not want to control every single aspect of it, and you just can't. You just can't. It's too complicated.
No. So what advice would you give, you know, when there are people who are creating shows like this, which is based on people's stories in that way? What advice do you think you would give to industry professionals about how to achieve that without, you know, compromising someone's storytelling or their character or whatever it is that, you know, their mum or their dad or whoever is being portrayed in that? What sort of advice would you give to people? I think it's difficult
because there is a sort of compromise. Just as a creative person, full stop, you know, it'd be really great to think that you're just producing something in a vacuum. But, you know, there is always the audience and there is always the patron, or, you know, the publisher, the producer. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. So there's always a bit of tension there between who you're writing for. I think one of the best bits of advice that my agent gave me, because it was really difficult and it was difficult for my family, and there was a lot of tension and there was a lot of people freaking out. You know, my relationship with my mum is really good now, and I think that she's quite ashamed of how some things were back then. And, you know, I think she was really worried about something going out that's suggesting that, you know, she wasn't a good mother, which, you know, who wouldn't be freaking out over that, you know? And of course you don't want to feel like you're upsetting your mother, you know. There were other tensions, and I think it's fair to say that my mental health had a bit of a wobble last year, certainly, particularly in the context in which all of this is happening at a time is, you know, really hostile for trans people, and then you're going to go and stick your head above the parapet. But my agent said to me, you know, do whatever you need to do. You know, this is literally uncharted territory. And again, I don't mean it in a humble brag way, but, you know, there hasn't been a trans person that's been a showrunner on a show like this. You know, in the UK, there's great people in the States, and Janet Mock. You know, there are great trans creatives out there, and that's fantastic. But nobody had done this here in this way, and so it's like I've just really given myself permission to do, and more generally, actually, in this country, I feel like a long time ago, I made a pact with myself that I am going to do whatever I need to do to be okay. I've lost too many friends who are not here. You know, and there, but for the grace of God, go I, you know, and I don't mean that to be dramatic. You know, there's a very real possibility that I might not be sitting here right now, but, you know, I'll kill you before I kill myself. You know, don't quote me. I'm not a transgender serial killer. This is why I don't do talks.
No,
but you get it. It's like, so you know, and so I haven't been on social media. I haven't, you know, it's like I've just always put myself first, because, you know, this country does not protect and value trans women. Obviously, there are nice people. You know, I'm sure we're all great people here today. But you know, it's like, I think it's fair to say that this society is not set up to sort of help us flourish and be our best selves. So if we're not going to look after ourselves, and I think it also teaches other people to treat you with respect. So I've always been quite uncompromising and intransigent in that way anyway, and I don't think I would be here if I hadn't have been like that. So that's the best advice, is you've got to back yourself, and it's a bit corny, but you do have to believe in yourself and stand your ground, actually. And I did, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There were things that I fought for. I didn't get everything, but the things that I felt really strongly about that had to be in there and had to be changed, I fought for them and I got them, you know. So
yeah, I think there's that element of people maybe not quite understanding how much you're putting out there. You're making yourself so vulnerable to society, especially when there is a lot of negativity around trans issues, the way we're treated in the media and politics. And I think that's maybe sometimes what industry professionals don't quite understand, and don't quite understand the depth of that pressure, which is why it's so important for things to be represented in a certain way, because even the smallest thing can send the wrong message. And if you're not a trans person and you don't have that experience, you might not catch that. So I think it's that pressure, and we've talked about this a lot, you know, how you phrase things, how things come across. And in your show there is a lot of, you know, quite provocative, quite outrageous things that happen, and then there's the question, how is this going to be received? Are you going to be monstered by the press for doing something in that? Are they going to think this is exactly who you are? There's a lot of pressures to navigate there. And I think also, you know, you're representing a working class background, which I think often happens in TV series, and sometimes it's very focused on those hardships. But do you think it's also important to maybe tell stories that have that joy of overcoming obstacles, like Byron does in the show, of sort of overcoming that, and at the end, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it, but they achieve a very important goal.
It does ultimately end with me here on stage,
speaking
to you all, so I don't die in it. Yeah. It's again, I think I would just, not to sound like really pretentious, but genuinely my primary goal in writing this, well, two actually, was, I think with the book I just wanted to tell the truth. I just wanted to tell the truth, because I just feel like I've grown up in a society where people are talking about me and people like me, and they're just not telling the truth. It's like, let's just be, like, I just want to be honest. Not everybody has to agree with me, but that is what it was like to be that sort of person in that time and place, you know. And I just wanted an honest record of it. Not everybody has to agree with it, so it wasn't a PR exercise with the trans community. It's that I didn't want to educate people. I wasn't really beating a drum in that sense. And with the TV show particularly, I just wanted it to entertain people. I mean, you know, I there are writers who are more capable than me in lots of different ways, but I do know that I can make people cry with my writing, and I do know that I can make people laugh, and I wanted to do that with this show. I thought if I can just connect with people, that was my goal. And so I wasn't really thinking about, but then of course, you know, you are aware that there is a scarcity of representation. And so, you know, I've always said I can't represent a community, you know, and thankfully we have got lots of people who are sort of out there now. So I don't think there's as much pressure as I maybe felt 10 years ago when there weren't that many voices in the UK and around the world. But you have got that on your shoulder. But I just, I just don't think anybody wants to feel like they're being hit over the head with something. And to be honest with you, you could argue it's not a particularly positive representation of trans people. I think if it hadn't have been a trans person writing it and it was a true story, and, you know, some middle class, you know, white guy came in and said, oh, we're going to do this thing, and it's a transgender, you know, prostitute and ketamine fiend, it's like, it probably wouldn't have been commissioned, would it? You know, so I just wanted to tell the truth. Yeah,
and I think that's what shines through in the series, that it is your story. It's not a story about the whole community and to represent everyone. It's just your actual story of what you went through, and I think that's why people can connect to it in such a way. But in the series, there's also that those friendships that are shown, it's sort of nodding to the sort of chosen family sort of thing, because it sort of shows your family being quite bad and not reacting in the right ways, and you sort of find your chosen family. But there's also the toxicity and the difficult relationships even within that family. And I guess, how is it sort of navigating showing that community, not necessarily in the most positive way, in that friend group was there in the end, but they definitely had their challenges to sometimes support one another, also because they were all going through so many difficult things. So
well, I think this is a really good example, actually, about what we were asked here today to talk about. And I was really excited when the invite came in for today, actually, because, I'm really proud of things that I've done in the past. But I made a decision a few years ago is that I don't want to be a professional trans person, where you just get paid to go around talking about being trans, essentially, which is, it's going to be good money if you get it. When I used to get asked to conferences and things, it would be, oh, hey, could you just talk about your identity, basically? And you basically going around saying, oh, well, I'm a bit different and people weren't very nice to me, and so it'd be really nice if people could be nice to me, kind of thing, which is a good message to put out there. But when this came through, I think they said, we want to talk about, the conflict between, how do we manage the conflict between keeping authentic stories, and how is that shaped by sort of overarching cultural narratives? And I thought, this is really interesting. This is about storytelling, and this is like relevant to all of us, right? Particularly at this moment in time, where politically we've got all of these competing stories about the world and what direction we want to go in, feels really relevant to me. And I think, God, I'm all over the place, aren't I? The question was about the
sort of friendships within.
Oh, the friendships, the friendships. So that was a really good example, in that I feel like a lot of people, there is this overarching narrative of, when you come out, you find your chosen family, right? And I think that it says something really interesting about the stories that get told, because oftentimes the stories that get told are not necessarily the reality of the stories that we want here. It's the world as we want it to be. And I don't think in my book that's what I wrote. It certainly wasn't my intention. Yes, it is important. I mean, our friendship is of course it's important to find your tribe. But actually, I think in my book, when I meet the LGBT community, I'm being taken advantage of by older predatory men. And actually, some of the worst abuse that I've had has actually come from LGBTQ people and women purporting to be feminists. So the narrative of, you find your chosen family is not quite what I put out. But then when we made the show, I feel like other people wanted it to be that. And it's no shade or criticism of anybody. I think that it's just interesting. That's what it ended up being and representing to people. And I thought that wasn't really what I was saying. But I think we all want to believe in that narrative, when the reality is that actually the community can be quite hostile, and it can be very bitchy, and it can be very unsupportive, actually. And again, coming back to the truth of it, it's like, that's why people say, oh, it's, the feedback I got from people said, oh, it's really good, people are really horrible women, and they're not like, one-dimensional. And I'm like, what are you watching? It's like, what are you watching ordinarily? It's like, that's life, isn't it? It's like who, and so that is the reality for me. I mean, I'm very screwed up by my, I've done a lot of therapy, but back then I was a horrible bitch, and I took that out on the people around me, the people that were close to me. And so that's just a really interesting example for me about how that isn't what I wrote, but that's the story that's come out of it.
Yeah, people take what they want away from these shows, isn't it? People always like to sort of position themselves in relation to whatever they're watching. So sometimes, someone will say, oh, it was all about the friendships, and you're like, well, it was actually about my trauma and how horrible everyone was.
Yeah.
And that sort of is interesting, because there will always be, you can speak to 10 different people and then have 10 different takes on what it was and what was the purpose of the show.
Well, when we went to the premiere, my friend Patricia came, and there was a lot of talk, and people were like, oh, wow, it's really this, it's that, and it's really nostalgic, and blah, 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 blah. And Patricia was like really moved, and she was like, we've just seen two really horrible acts of violence in the first episode against a child, a young person. It's like, for me, this is about like how we treat kids and how we and it's like no one's talking about it. It's almost like, oh, that's just accepted, you know. It's like people are focusing on the scene in the toilets or this or that, and so it's really fascinating what people take out of something and how it's framed by the stories we want to tell, or the stories we want to hear.
Yeah, definitely. My watch broke this morning, so when I have 5 minutes left, if someone could just wave me, then I have 5 minutes left. Okay, great, good. That's good to know. Don't want to run too much over time today, but I guess that sort of brings us anyway to sort of the last question that we sort of talked about. You know, what do we want to leave with people? And I guess it's also about those people out there like yourself who never thought your story was something that would make it to screen. Maybe young people who are really struggling in their lives and they just think, why would anybody care about me? But then we have you as an example of someone who came from a really difficult background. So what would be your advice to people who are in that position, and you know, how would they find that self-worth that you found?
I'm probably not going to say what I'm supposed to say.
You're not supposed to say.
I did Kathy Newman's podcast a few years ago, and it was about sort of like women in business, or like, you know, inspirational, like career women. And she said, oh, come on, you know, you're doing really well. And it was nice that she wanted to include me. And she said, you know, what advice would you have to anybody, you know, getting into, you know, how did you do it? And I think she was expecting me to say sort of like, you know, well, get up in the morning, you know, and have like just 3 things on your to-do list, and make sure that, you know, and always believe in yourself. And I said, well, the reality is, Kathy, is I wouldn't have actually got a start in journalism if I hadn't have been having sex for money. And I wouldn't have been able to have funded those unpaid internships if I hadn't have actually got into a relationship with a middle-class man who sort of like bankrolled me for about 2 years. And that is the reality. And the reality is I didn't have family support, and I wouldn't have been able to have afforded to have gone to university if I hadn't have been doing sex work. So it's all very well, so look at you, you're doing well, and you know, you've done well out of this country, haven't you? It's like, yeah, but at what cost? And I don't mean that in a victimy way, but I think it's really important to actually talk about that is the reality. I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't have done that. So what does a working class trans kid, or a black kid, or, you know, somebody who is marginalized in some way in this country, what does it take for you in order to be in the mix, you know, to be on question, you know, to be invited to take part in things that nobody else in my town? And it's not because I think, you know, I'm an extraordinary person. I think that, you know, it's just chance and a determination, and maybe, you know, the fact that I didn't feel welcome there is that I've sought to be part of other things, you know, because I didn't feel welcome in my hometown. But the reality is, I've had to make some hard choices to get, and I want to be really, really, really honest about that. But I would say, on a slightly more positive note, just focus and just be laser focused on what you've got to do. I mean, I've really cut out social media. I've cut out dating, you know, like, you know, it's like, I've just been laser focused on getting this done. And you can do anything that you want to do, but you can't do everything. So, you know, and maybe there's a life lesson in there. You know, it's like, if we're choosing to do this one thing, it's also saying no to these other things. And you know, as we came in, somebody was saying, oh, it's really good, you're doing really well. And I said, well, it's just as well, really, because I literally have nothing else happening in my life. I don't have children, I don't have a husband, I don't have a house, I don't have a salary, I don't, you know, it's like I literally put all of my eggs in this basket. So thank God it's going well. So I would just say, stick to your guns, keep your eye on the prize, and at the risk of sounding corny, believe in yourself and don't take any shit.
Thank you so much, Tara. Well, I think that concludes our lovely conversation. And thank you, Paris, again, for being always so generous, open, and honest. It really shines through in everything that you do, and I'm so privileged to be your friend as well. And thank you everyone for coming today and listening.